call this work session to order. Let's go around the room and start by introducing ourselves. With you, Mr. Gates.
Chris Schutte, Director of Boston Economic Community Development.
Dave Whitfield with the Planning Department.
Robin Ward, Chief Housing Officer.
Dyson.
Forrest Dunbar.
Christopher Constant.
Pete Peterson.
Big Train. Felix Rivera. John Weddleton.
Great. All right. So today we're going to have our first work session on the accessory dwelling unit ordinance. We plan to have at least one more committee meeting before public hearing at the first meeting in June, and potentially another work session, depending on how things go. So with that, Chris, I understand you guys have a...
Yeah, before we get started, Mr. Chairman, thank you for this opportunity to talk a little bit about the accessory dwelling unit changes that you're seeing before you. So this is a proposal to modify portions of Title 21 that has a very long history. This is an issue related to the imbalance that exists currently between our housing supply and our housing needs, both now and in the future. We are in a position where for the past several years we have been unable to produce the volume of housing units of all types, whether we're talking single family homes or apartment homes, et cetera, to meet projections of where our population will be in 20, 30, and 40 years. So as part of that impending imbalance, there's been a lot of work spent over the past 6 to 8 years looking at what are the options for our city on improving housing affordability and improving housing supply. As part of that work, which includes the 2012 McDowell Housing Study, the 2040 Land Use Plan Update, which you just adopted, and all the work done by some of the trade groups and organizations such as AEDC's Live, Work, Play Housing Group, Anchorage Home Builders Association, and others, we're looking at what are the various tools we can have in our toolbox when it comes to improving housing affordability and increasing production of housing units of all kinds. Today we're going to focus on one type in particular. This is known as the accessory dwelling unit. It has a lot of colloquial names like father-in-law apartment, mother-in-law apartment, kids apartment, take your pick.
Grandparents.
Grandparents, thank you, yes. Aging in place is very important. The accessory dwelling units do exist currently in Anchorage Municipal Code, and through the work over the past, almost 2 years now, with AEDC's Live, Work, Play Housing Group, the home builders, and others, we have put forth some proposed changes to Title 21 to modify this particular section of the code to make accessory dwelling units easier and more accessible to more homeowners across the bowl. This has gone before the Planning and Zoning Commission. It was approved unanimously, 3 months ago, somewhere around there. And so we've just now gotten around to bringing it to you, and we look forward to the discussion. If somebody can get the lights, Robin will get us started on our presentation.
And let me note for the record, we've been joined by Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amy.
Hand it over to
those-
Robin.
We happen to have sandwiches in the back if anyone would like to get lunch. There's plenty, so any of the members of the audience too, if you'd like to get a sandwich, we have some today. See, there we go, we got one taker. All right, go ahead, Chris.
Actually, Robin's going to go from here.
Sorry.
Actually, Dave is going to go from
Okay, whoever's going to do it.
Dave.
So as Chris mentioned, the municipality of Anchorage is really experiencing an imbalance in housing types, and I think that's apparent in the 2040 Land Use Plan. In fact, the 2040 Land Use Plan identifies a need for an additional 21,000 residential units, of which 1,000 new ADUs is needed or anticipated by the year 2040. As we go through this presentation, I'd like to first start with how the new, or I should say the current code for ADUs, what it states and what requirements exist today. ADUs are allowed in all residential zoning districts. However, ADUs in our R1, R1A districts, which are our single-family residential districts, are only allowed to be attached, meaning they cannot be detached, they cannot be a separate home. Allows for ADUs in residential districts, attached ADUs on residential districts of lots 10,000 square feet or greater, or where that lot abuts an alley. And this excludes or accepts the R1, R1A districts. So R1, R1A only allows for attached. In the R4 and R4A districts, ADUs are allowed on lots that are already improved with a detached single-family dwelling unit as of January 1, 2014. The reason for this is that we want to encourage, these are our higher density residential districts, we want to encourage that higher density. So those structures that are non-conforming for single family would be the only properties that would allow for an ADU. Currently, code limits the ADU size to 700 square feet, in addition to the limitation that the ADU be no larger than 35% of the principal dwelling unit. ADUs are not permitted on any lot with a child care center. Robin? The ADU or the principal dwelling unit has to be owner occupied, meaning that you can't rent out both the accessory dwelling unit and the principal dwelling unit. Some people have concerns about the possibility of a duplex type feel.
Do you want at the end of the?
No, this one. My question, Mr. Dixon, who's going to check on this to make sure it's actually happening? Is it late driven, or we're going to have a whole new department of the city check on these apartments? Because normally people just ignore the regulations.
Through the chair, Mr. Trainey, the planning department has an affidavit of owner occupancy requirement. So when they pull a building permit for the ADU, they're required to come to the planning department and submit an affidavit of owner occupancy, and we have that on file in our office.
Through the chair, I'll add also that the property appraisal department also has access to this. And if you look at some of the properties listed on CAMA, you can see that they have been flagged or identified as being an accessory, having accessory dwelling units. Property appraisal, I believe, uses the permanent fund dividend as a check against whether or not a property owner actually lives in a residence. They do that primarily to verify the residential property tax exemption, but it's also a way of verifying that if an individual has an accessory dwelling unit, that they are registered at one of the addresses.
Okay, so it's not going to be just complaint driven then?
No.
This is the current code. This already.
That is correct.
Already exists. And I'll add, not propose a change.
You have a simple like this, where it's complaint driven for us,
Sure.
and unless somebody complains, or you guys know about it, it never happens. I just want to know how we're going to make sure this doesn't.
I welcome your amendment to get rid of the owner occupancy requirement. All
Well,
right.
you won't like all my amendments, I guarantee you, boys.
So currently, ADUs can have no more than 2 bedrooms. This obviously restricts the size of the ADUs. An ADU may encroach into a rear yard setback only when it abuts an alley. 1 off-street parking space is required above the principal structure parking requirement. So I know parking is a real issue. The current code requires 1 additional parking space per ADU. In addition to that, you cannot exceed any of the other zoning regulations, lot coverage, maximum height, setbacks. So this doesn't provide an exemption from any of the other zoning limitations that would exist on a particular piece of property. And then ADUs need to be built to a standard, to the adopted building code standards for 2-family dwellings. Robin? So let's compare the current code to what is proposed in this ordinance. This ordinance allows ADUs, detached ADUs in our single-family districts, the R1, R1A districts. It would increase the maximum size of an ADU to 900 square feet or 75% of the principal dwelling unit square footage, whichever is greater. I'm sorry, whichever is less. I'm sorry. Required parking, so that 1 required parking stall could be provided on street only when approved by the municipal traffic engineer. So the municipal traffic engineer would have standards for what the street looks like, whether it's built to code, and would evaluate whether or not on-street parking could be provided. It reduces the front setback for detached ADUs to 40 feet. This is a decrease from 60 feet, or that detached ADU be at least 10 feet behind the front-facing facade of the principal dwelling unit. It increases the maximum height of accessory structures in the R1 and R1A districts to 25 feet. Currently, the R1 and R1A districts have a 20-foot limitation, but ADUs are allowed to be 25 feet, so there was an inconsistency there. So we increased the accessory structure height to 25 feet in the R1, R1A. Detached ADUs taller than 15 feet shall have a minimum of a 10-foot side yard setback, abutting a neighboring R1 or R1A lot. So this is to protect the neighboring lots. So when you have an ADU, a detached ADU in the R1 and R1A that exceeds 15 feet in height, you have to set it back 10 feet. Setbacks in the R1 are typically 5 feet, so it's an additional 5-foot setback.
Can I'm going to interrupt you just there for a second there, David. So I want to first note for the record that we're joined by Mr. Croft, and then Mr. Trainee has a question. And
Quick
then
question on the
myself.
on-street parking.
Yes, sir.
Do you envision any sort of additional cost? Because my concern is we don't plow snow in Anchorage as it is. I get numerous complaints.
Yes.
So how are we going to mitigate that if we're letting more cars park on the street? Are you going to have an additional cost that comes into the city to
Well,
get around these or to deal with them on the street?
in conversations with the municipal traffic engineer, she would be reluctant to approve the on-street parking if the road was not constructed to a full width and to standard for whatever zoning district the ADU would be located in. So if it didn't,
There's no, you can't even, on a normal, get through the driveways there.
and in those cases, more than likely, she would not grant the on-street parking approval.
Okay, thank you.
So I have a question, then Mr. Dyson has a question. So, and I apologize that this was on the previous slide and I just missed it. So, my understanding was that you could build an ADU now, or maybe it's not called an ADU, on top of a garage, a detached garage. So, for example, in South Edition, we have a number of those kind of interesting duplexes that have these detached garages. How does that play into these regulations, or does it?
So yes, it is called an ADU, and yes, in most zoning districts, you could build an ADU above a garage. The exception is in the R1, R1A districts, those single-family districts that don't allow detached ADUs.
So it's considered a detached, even though the garage is kind of its own thing, but it's still considered detached.
If the garage is attached to the principal structure, then they could do it. If it's detached, they cannot.
Okay. Interesting. Okay, Mr. Dyson.
How does this affect Eagle River's zoning?
This does not affect Eagle River at all.
Or
This-
Girdwood.
Or Girdwood. Or Girdwood. This ordinance is not intended to affect Girdwood or Eagle River. Only the Anchorage Wolf.
Can I ask them, what is the ADU policy in Girdwood and Eagle River? Is it?
So both have their own chapters, Chapter 9 for Girdwood, Chapter 10, and there are regulations regarding ADUs in both chapters.
Are they generally more restrictive or more permissive than the ADU in the bowl?
Without referring back to the code, I'd be guessing. I would say that they're probably in Eagle River more restrictive.
More restrictive?
I believe so.
Interesting. Okay. I think I'd be sort of curious to know what their experience is, particularly in Girdwood. And this seemed like it could be something positive for Girdwood. Anyway, please continue.
Good for the next slide.
So this slide kind of gives you a breakdown of where our ADUs exist in Anchorage. The vast majority of them exist in our lower density areas, the hillside, the R6, R7, R8 areas. There are quite a few in our single family and mixed residential areas. Obviously, this ordinance is intended to provide additional ADUs in those single family and mixed residential areas. That's our primary focus. Robin? Again, this is an idea of where the ADUs exist in town. As you see, the hillside has the vast majority of ADUs. Robin?
We might point out too that these are both legal and some
Illegal.
of those that are not, I hate to call them illegal, but they haven't been registered with the planning department.
Are you not conforming on them?
No, it doesn't say they're not conforming. We don't know that. They just weren't registered with the planning
So
department.
it's, go ahead.
I would say through the chair, so this map is the byproduct of bridging that gap that we described earlier between the affidavits that are filed with the planning department and the properties that have been flagged or identified by property appraisal. There was not two-way communication prior, there was one-way communication. And as part of the work that went into both examining ADUs across the bowl and actually physically creating this map, that two-way communication channel was identified. So when we say illegal, I agree with Robin and Dave, that's not a proper term. It just means that it either did not file an affidavit with the planning department, or it filed an affidavit with the planning department and it was not flagged by property appraisal. Now that the two-way communication has been established, we know where you are.
Mr. Weddleton.
You know, it's just, I mean, we got a lot on the hillside, but before the ADU ordinance, which was, when was this originally done?
2003.
2003, correct.
2003, but before that, you could have mother-in-law apartments on R6, is that right? It wasn't-
I don't know if they were strictly prohibited, but I know that they weren't actually written in the code. So I would have to do some research, Mr. Weddleton, to figure that out. I would err on the side of caution and say that no, you couldn't do it.
I think it was done a lot, so it's not, I don't think that this was a response to the 2003 ordinance. My guess is they've been out there for years.
They have, yes.
Yeah. Do you have the numbers of how many, Mr. Dyson? Well, I'm going to ask my question first. Do you have the numbers on how many were, so we said 2003 was when the last one was built. Do we have any sense of how many were built or permitted in the last 14 to 15 years using that process, using the regulatory process of establishment?
We don't have that, through the chair, I don't have that information at my fingertips, but we could figure that out based on the dates of the affidavits. Where it'll be tough is in those accessory dwelling units that did not receive the affidavit but were flagged by property appraisal. We're not exactly sure when they got flagged. But we could analyze the data on the affidavit side and tell you.
Well, I don't require a high degree of specificity there. I'm just curious, under the existing regulatory framework, about how many ADUs are built and or permitted in the bowl.
So on average,
New ones.
the planning department and the building department receive between 15 and 20 applications for new accessory dwelling units per year. When you analyze that towards the goal of 1,000 new ADUs in Anchorage by 2040, that number would have to double for us to reach that goal. So that gives you just kind of a broad idea of where we're at.
Okay. Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Dyson and then Mr. Weddleton.
So, awkward question, but I assume. Well, most of these we're talking about where there's public water and sewer.
Yeah, so
Except on the hillside.
on the hillside, obviously, if you do an ADU, you have to have a septic system that's adequately sized for the number of bedrooms that you have in that home in ADU. So as long as you can do that and you can meet the minimum requirements of Title 21 for the ADU, you could theoretically have it. In Anchorage, in the urban areas where water and sewer is readily available, it might be a little easier to do it because you don't have to deal with the septic restraints.
Through the chair, let me add a little additional nuance to that. It was mentioned in one of the earlier slides, but one of the interesting characteristics of accessory dwelling units from the building safety side is that they are treated as if they are duplexes. So when evaluating accessory dwelling units for things like adequate water, sewer, et cetera, the measurements that are done, they are done for basically a double dwelling occupancy. So there are higher standards, if you will, placed on adding an accessory dwelling unit, to answer your question, Senator Dyson, in order to ensure that the infrastructure is adequate for that additional dwelling.
I'll add to that, while they're looked at on the building permit side as a duplex for building code requirements, they are clearly accessory and subordinate to the principal dwelling unit on the property as single family. So,
Thank you. Mr. Weddleton and Mr. Constant.
I think I'll wait. I mean, I think the big debate will be, do these belong in R1 and R1? So I'll wait.
The answer is yes.
So,
Mr.
to your
Constant.
point, Mr. Tyson, the biggest problem that I see in my professional experience with hillside and on private water is that a lot of these that are unregistered are built and they're not really accounted for in the engineering of the water system. And where they take the hit is when they go to sell. Because when you have to get the COSA certificate
That's right.
for your transfer, you have suddenly exceeded the capacity that you're allowed to have on your water and well system, and you have to prove up before you can transfer the title. And so it's an interesting little problem that people are experiencing nowadays.
And it's because they were built outside the regulatory framework to begin with?
Or the question didn't quite get asked in the right way in the permitting, if they were permitted, and the permitting, I don't know if it requires an updated COSA or keeps up to that, but really that's the practical implication that I'm seeing of this today is that people are spending thousands of dollars to repair problems of the past.
Through the chair, one additional nuance, if you're talking about ways to avoid getting caught building an accessory dwelling unit, we do regularly see, and I won't rat anybody out, but we do regularly see building plans that have a very nice looking man cave with a spot identified for things like a sink and stove where they do not install them. They get their final inspection, they receive their certificate of occupancy, and then at that point we don't know if they actually put in that sink and that stove, or then take it out when they go to sell the property. So what we're hoping with these additional changes to accessory dwelling units is that we can avoid people trying to sneak around the system.
Mr. Train?
I think this came out of Portland. Portland has state of Oregon requirements with ADUs. Does the state of Alaska have any ADU requirements too?
Through the chair, none that I am familiar with, no.
Okay. Have you looked at Oregon and Portland specifically?
Through the chair, absolutely.
And you saw the reference to the Oregon ADU statutes, but we've got nothing here in the state of Alaska.
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Through the chair, Mr. Trainee, we don't have a statewide building code. That's how Oregon has a little bit more control, that Alaska doesn't. We don't have a statewide building code.
Thank you, Robin.
The state doesn't make inspections these days anyway, right?
You what?
The state doesn't do inspections these days anyway, right? Craig?
I know they said they're going to inspect on sites looking for marijuana here. Anyway,
Next slide, please.
Okay.
let's see here and there.
So we want to give you an idea of what you might be looking at if you were to approve this ordinance. These two pictures, depict detached ADUs above a detached garage. It's a good. We think that they're good examples of ADUs that we might expect to see here in Anchorage.
They exist here in
Actually,
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
These are in South Edition,
yeah,
but
these
they.
actually exist.
Yeah.
So this is permitted because they're not in R1 or R1A, is that right?
So detached, yes, these are South Edition. South Edition is a mix of R2, R2A, R2M. Yeah. So they would be permitted as detached.
And they may have smaller lots, but they have got an alley.
Great.
Next slide.
Question? Yeah, next slide, please.
Again, examples of detached ADUs. The one that I will point out here is the one at the top left. This is a detached ADU not associated or not above a garage. This is an independent ADU, basically a small house on a lot with a principal dwelling unit. So you might expect to see that, or you could expect to see the one directly below it, an ADU above a garage. So, Robin?
That's it.
Okay.
Yeah. We just wanted to give you some depictions of what you might be looking at.
And one last addition through the chair, the bottom right, and I'm not entirely sure if that garage is attached or detached, but it almost looks like it is attached, and maybe is on a corner lot. So one of the things that other people have asked is you asked earlier, is how can you build an accessory dwelling unit over a garage now if that garage is attached to the house? Answer is yes, and this could be one, how it might look in Anchorage.
The one in the top left corner that's not above a garage, is that legal? Essentially, is that permitted?
If
Yes.
it meets the requirements where it would be 60 feet back, correct?
40 feet back.
40 feet.
No,
back.
that's proposed today.
Today,
Would
correct.
be 60 feet back.
Or 10 feet beyond the front-facing facade
Right.
of the principal structure.
I was just wondering if it was under our current code if it was.
It actually, it could be in certain zones today.
Great. Is that the end of your presentation?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Great. So, Mr. Welton, you said you had a question for the end?
I don't know if now's the time. I think it'll come up when we talk about fixed amendment.
Okay. Do we want to go through? I mean, we could either do Dixon Amendment first, or we could go through your comments here, Mr. Welton.
Mr. Chair, we actually have prepared, I think, pretty good responses to the list of questions we got this morning. So if you'd like to work through that, we don't think it'll take too long, but it might help address some of the future concerns or questions if you'd like.
That works for me.
Yeah, let's start. Let's do that then. Let's go through, and hopefully there are copies out there for the public of Mr. Weddleton's comments.
Yes, they're on the table. Great, thank you. So through the chair, this first answer unfortunately is going to sound like we're booting all of the questions to later, but this is literally one that is not in our camp. The question of does an increase in rentals in a given neighborhood do anything to property values? We sent that question to property appraisal for their input, and I haven't gotten a response back yet, but as soon as we do, we will share it with the body.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah.
I just say, I sent these in late last night, so if they don't have answers, then you got it first.
Yeah, I got it first thing this morning. So on that one, we're waiting for input from property appraisal. On the second question, and this is, I understand, one that's a little confusing, so I'll do my best to walk through the answer. The question is essentially asking whether or not we need to have that obtuse language when it comes to a quote-unquote ADU permit, and whether or not we can just remove everything else from the remainder of that clause and just say that the property owner will need to get an ADU permit. The challenge with that is that there is no such thing in building safety code or in Title 23 as a ADU permit. ADUs are accessory structures. They are not primary structures, and so therefore they don't have a permit type in the building code. So in order to process these, or in order for someone to build an accessory dwelling unit, they do have to submit for the normal required permits for a given construction type, whether it's an additional unit like we saw in the top left corner, or an above garage unit like we see in some of the other pictures. So because of that, because there is no ADU permit, and because we require the affidavit, what this clause says in essence is if you are filing an affidavit that states you are going to build or have an ADU, and you go forth and you apply for all the building permits that would be required, that action constitutes a quote-unquote ADU permit. I can tell you don't like that answer, but that's the best I can do.
Mr. Well,
I think I'm a big proponent of just saying what you mean. I would say make an ADU permit that encompasses all that stuff and say get an ADU permit, and then the whole world will know, okay, I got to do that. But reading this now,
So
it's so convoluted, it's like, huh?
Through
That's
the
why you're
chair.
not getting more ADUs, one, because
Can't
ADU
understand it.
itself is such bad branding, and then you read this and go, I didn't want to go there anymore.
yeah. So through the chair, we could consider that. I'd have to sit down with the development services staff, and it would require a change to a different section of code to create such a permit, but we could certainly consider it. I think given that it has been the law of the land for the past 15 years anyway, that at least in the initial stages, if this should pass, it would be acceptable to continue as is, and we can have that discussion about further permit types down the road.
I can live with that, but sure.
It's not always pretty making the sausage. I'm sorry. Okay, next question about the Title 20 User's Guide. This is a remnant from the existing code. This is verbatim from existing code. However, we appreciate your point, and we would be fine if you wish to strike it entirely.
would you like to offer that kind of amendment, Sean?
Yeah.
Anyway, just
Do we want to, as is a broader point, you know, if we go through here and we see little changes like that, or like the little typo that I had found before,
Sure.
do we want to have an S version of this?
so
or-
we suspect that there will be, based on the typographical changes that you saw, and if things like this elimination of a reference to the Title 21 User's Guide are supported, we would support striking that too, and could put that into an S version.
And we have plenty of time to do
Yes, we
that
do.
and still hit the hit the public hearing deadline in early
31
June.
days.
Dean, did you want to have a comment?
Just quickly, what's your timeline for this version? When will you introduce and have it?
If probably if we get through today, we could have it introduced first thing next week, Monday or Tuesday.
For the regular agenda, would you talk or
Correct.
What's the, it's 7 days before, right? So in theory, we could, as late as June 4th or June 5th, you could get S version without having to move the public hearing, is that correct?
Through the chair, if we can, if depending on the level of changes that go into a proposed S version, we could have the S version ready to submit on Monday or Tuesday of next week, which would give everybody still 3.5 weeks to review it.
Okay. All right, thank you. Want to continue, Mr. Weddleton?
Can I just,
Yeah, sorry.
as usual, I'm 1 or 2 steps behind Mr. Weddleton. So this is a different permit, so he's saying make it an ADU permit, and can you do that one more time? Why?
Sure. Through the chair, so I believe the intent of Mr. Weddleton's question is, can't we just have something that is called an ADU permit?
And you said why?
And our answer is that such a thing does not exist currently, but because in order to construct an ADU and own an ADU, you're required to do 2 things already. You're required to file your affidavit with the planning department and then go through the normal permitting process for whatever it is you're building. Our feeling is that these 2 things together constitute an ADU permit, so let's not make more paperwork.
The affidavit plus the normal permit means it's an
Correct.
ADU permit.
Correct.
All right, thank you.
All right.
Okay.
Mr. Schutte.
Yeah, moving on, the next question is about the use of a phrase principal dwelling unit versus residence, and we think that's a great observation. We'd be fine with changing that back to dwelling since it would stay consistent throughout the document and could incorporate that change in our S version. Okay. Moving on, the next question is more of a comment about preservation of yard and open space, making the statement that yard and open space decreases when an ADU is built. It doesn't seem to make sense. For this one, I want to refer back to something that Mr. Whitfield talked about, which is lot coverage. And the fact that the ADU code as it exists currently and the ADU code changes we're proposing do nothing to change the by right lot coverage that every property owner currently enjoys. So if you can build a home that occupies 30% of your lot presently, and you want to build an ADU, provided you keep your lot coverage, including that accessory dwelling unit, below the 30% threshold, it would be acceptable. So in essence, by not changing the maximum allowable lot coverage of a given structure, or structures in this case, it does preserve yard and open space. In other words, it doesn't grant any additional benefit to a property owner.
Furthermore, you can't violate the underlying zoning district setback requirements, which would further the open space in yards.
Correct.
Mr. Wells.
Well, I understand that, appreciate it, but, if I'm a neighbor and I don't want that ADU in my neighbor's thing, I'm going to say, wait a minute, he's not preserving yards and open space. In fact, now we are 900 square feet less, right? Because this says you'll preserve yards and open space.
So through the chair, I think that that's probably true, but the same neighbor could instead just modify their existing home and fill up that at 30%.
But if I
probably would be much less appealing.
Strike this because it's not a goal of ADUs. I mean, that's the goal of ADUs is to get more housing. It just seems kind of out there. It's stated as a goal, but it's not a goal of ADUs.
Within the previously allowed, I mean, it's not preserving, but it's within the prior limitation.
It's within, yes, exactly, through the chair. That was the motivation for mentioning that, is that by not granting any additional benefit to property owners who pursue an ADU, by not increasing the amount of their property they can cover with structures, we feel that helps preserve open space. If we allow the ADU to not count towards lot coverage, that would very clearly limit open space.
But I think we're all in agreement that legally that phrase is not really impacting anything. I mean, you're saying that you've got this certain lot coverage, you've got those laws in place. It's really just a question of sort of messaging, right? I mean, and I think John's point, I don't want to speak for him, but it's a little bit. It seems a little bit disingenuous. Is that what you're?
Yeah, essentially.
But on the other hand, if we strike it out, people might think that we are actually changing those lot coverage numbers when we're not.
That you're not. It's stated very clearly.
Through the chair, I'll add one more nuance to it. The section that it sits in is the section that outlines what are the purposes for having rules on ADUs. So in that regard, we felt that one of the purposes is to preserve the existing by right lot coverages. So that's why it sits in that particular section.
Mr. Gates.
Perhaps the language would be make more sense if it says something like in accordance with the lot coverage requirements, rather than preserving the outer open space. We have limited lot coverage already, so I think that would be consistent with the goals, right? Building ADU without exceeding lot coverage restrictions.
Do you have any staff thoughts on that, Mr. Whitfield?
Yeah, through the chair, Mr. Gates, I would agree with that language. However, if you're going to do that, you might as well put in, mention the step back requirements or the height. So by only mentioning one of the standards, the underlying zoning district standards, you might be suggesting that the others don't apply. And I would be concerned about that.
See, I don't know if that's actually the case, because this specifically deals with size,
Yeah.
right, rather than placement or height. And I think size, in this context at least, you're thinking of size as its square footage.
Through the chair, I think I understand the struggle we're having. I think we can develop some proposed language that moves it away from the troublesome concept of paving over all the fields in America, and be more specific that we're directly saying this does not increase the by right lot coverage. We'll figure out a way to phrase that better.
You want to do that, or want me to do that?
I'm sure you
It's
can.
fine, it's fine.
We'll take a swing at it in our S version if you're okay with that.
Thank you, guys. All right, moving on.
Sure. Next comment is related to negative impact on street parking. And I'll defer to Dave, but just reiterate what he mentioned earlier, that decisions on whether or not on-street parking would be acceptable for an ADU does fall to the traffic engineer, who's best suited to make those calls. I speak very highly of my colleague, the traffic engineer, but her typical answer is probably going to be no in most cases. So I just would point that out, that this is probably a very high bar to get over.
Comment on that is, and I understand that. Well, a couple of points. One is negative impact on on-street parking. On-street parking is not a negative; it's an amazing positive. We should have more of it. I get so many calls for speeding in my neighborhood, and if they parked on their streets, those 40-foot wide streets would now be 20, and people would drive slower. And I know from experience, because I live in Independence Park, which you would think is named after something patriotic, but it is not. They park independently everywhere. The streets are lined with cars, and we don't have speeding in our streets. And I mean, Dick's point on the snow storage is when they go to work, the streets are clear, and then they plow. I mean, it works great, because in my neighborhood, they're not dead cars. They are functioning cars. So it is good. And this kind of says negative impact of on-street parking. It's not negative. It's a positive. So let's say what we mean. You don't want to overcommit.
So let me correct you real quick. It actually says negative impacts to on-street parking, not of. And the intent of this was that the decisions of the traffic engineer to allow or not allow on-site parking should not come at the detriment of available on-street parking.
I understand that. So I think my phrasing is
okay.
She doesn't want to overcommit, right?
Mr.
Yeah.
Craney, then Mr. Constant.
Well, we can look at that.
One, I might remember that whoever the traffic engineer is based on the good wishes of the mayor, and that could change instantly. As we've seen many traffic engineers in the last 20 years here. So just because you've got it written down here doesn't mean you got the same ruling every time.
Yeah, through the chair, we recognize that, and my comment earlier was mostly in jest, but the traffic engineer uses the existing traffic standards in evaluating any deviation from traffic code, whether it's on-street parking or how many parking spaces you need for Jack's Pratt, and that was the expectation of every traffic engineer. So I think that we believe in the position rather than the person, and they will take that into consideration when evaluating these.
And except the last mayor didn't like speed bumps, so the last traffic engineer didn't approve any.
Who doesn't like speed bumps?
Sorry, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Craney. Mr.
How
Constant.
do you feel
Explain
about
for your future
speed bumps?
course.
How do you feel about speed bumps? I just, to the traffic engineer's credit, I just want to put on the record, since there was that guffaw laughter, that she's impeccable at her job, and she has probably one of the more challenging systems, because every little tiny decision impacts every other corner for the next 2 miles. of everything that she does, and so much credit to her in the difficulty of always saying no. So.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. So let's continue going down this line then.
Thank you. Unless you guys have anything to add. The next comment is about whether or not a particular clause should be in a different section. This is related to 1B3A4, which is on page 4, lines 8 through 13. We're okay. I think we're okay with moving it, but I would add that, again, like the earlier section, the items in this section relate directly to what is the reason for having rules on accessory dwelling units. And we felt that that was one of the reasons to have rules around accessory dwelling units rather than a purpose of having accessory dwelling units at all. But we're, of course, open to further discussion with Assemblymember Weddleton.
Do you have any follow-up on that, John? Okay.
Great. Moving on. Page 4, lines 22 through 32, is the restriction in the R1 and R1A to allow only attached a real barrier to building ADUs? And I would say yes. In what we have learned over the past several years in working with Live, Work, Play Housing Group, with the Neighborhood Home Builders Association, with various private practice architects, engineers, designers, and home builders, we almost unanimously hear that that is a barrier, that there are very suitable properties throughout the acreage bowl that because of their R1 or R1A designation and the size and the lack of alley, they just are unbuildable. And that's unfortunate, both retro and new construction, I would add. One of the things that I found really interesting in the past couple of years in working on this is that there is a lot of interest in new construction home builders to add accessory dwelling units as part of their overall design or overall product right out of the gate, which, if you know the costs of construction and home building, is the best time to actually add accessory dwelling units because it's cheaper to do it as part of new construction than as a retrofit. We're talking about addressing affordability of housing. That's something to keep in mind. So, as a long-winded answer, but yes, we think that it's true.
Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I haven't gone through and read this entire thing yet, but we're changing the size from 750 square feet up to 900 square feet is going to be allowed. Is there a minimum size? Because I keep seeing these smaller mini houses that they are talking about as 350 square feet.
Through the chair, Mr. Peterson, yes, in existing code, there is a minimum square footage of 300 square feet. However, I believe this ordinance removes that restriction. So it does not require 300 square feet.
I don't think it's a current code. That was removed in the title.
Minimum size for an ADU could be and have it still function?
I'll have, Mr. Peterson, I'll have to check again. Robin is.
I'll add to that there are also requirements about what a dwelling must provide for an occupant anyway. And because of the requirements of what you have to provide for a dwelling, there are practical limits to the smallness of a given unit.
Ms. Ward and then Mr. Weddleton, I think that is.
Through the chair, Mr. Peterson, remember that something inside, which is an attached, if you took an area of your existing home, there may not be the same requirement as it would be for detached. Detached will have a building code minimum square footage requirement for a functional unit. So it could be different whether it's attached or detached.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Mr. Weddleton?
Well, if the big thing is that builders want to do this when they build a new structure, I mean, to have it as part of the in the past, ADU should seem easier than doing it as a task. So you have a lot, you're a builder, and you want to do a house with an ADU. It's harder to do a detached one. You got to get more building permits, and it's more walls to build. They do it attached. It's easier.
Certainly, Mr. Whittleton, I would agree that it's probably cheaper and easier to attach it during new construction, but that'd be a matter of preference. I mean, certainly building a detached ADU as part of new construction is going to be much cheaper than it would be to add an ADU to an existing principal dwelling, a house. So.
But we're kind of, the goal of these changes is to get more of these built.
Correct.
And kind of what we're doing very dramatically is allowing them quite a bit more freely in R1 and R1A, which is really conceptually single-family home, but not anymore. Okay, so this is kind of the core issue that we're dealing with.
Wait, hold on, Mr. Welton. You have a single family that lived, you have an extended family where the parents live in the house and the children live in the ADU?
I understand this, but I mean, the concept, when you buy a house in R1, you're thinking, I'm buying a single-family home residential area, okay? And I understand, you can understand the things, but the general concept of texture, do that. And the comments we got is R1A, because R1A, I bought a single-family home, now you're making it duplex is allowed.
So through the chair, I would add that presently you are allowed to have attached, not detached in R1, R1A, and with the attached in R1, R1A, it's the same thing. I think what we're talking about is if there are detached ADUs allowed in R1, R1A, does it give the appearance of being either a duplex or two homes on a single lot? And I think the short answer is it probably does. But I also think that the question of whether or not that detracts from the value of an R1 or R1A lot or a given neighborhood is highly speculative and probably not true, at least not as supported by the examples in other communities. The value of properties in neighborhoods where accessory dwelling units go in typically really climbs because there's tremendous value in not only the income production of that property, but in the fact that you've got more people that live nearby that are using the parks, using the restaurants, using the trails, etc. So I think there are a lot more benefits that come from it, but visually speaking, as you walk up to a property to buy a house and you see something on the back corner that looks much like a tiny house, you might get the impression that yes, this is not the R1A I thought I was getting.
It's substantially different too, because the typical R1A, you would not have a lot of rentals. Most people own their homes. When you bring in a big proportion of renters, things change. Not everyone who rents knows how to function well in society. So you bring a very different kind of people. I'm going to sound negative here, but I understand the philosophy and the benefit. But we are getting pushback, which I think is not acceptable from people who bought an R1A for all the benefits, which are people own their homes, the density and so on. But we want to see more of these built. So by allowing detached in R1 and R1A, are we really going to see more? Is that truly what's limiting the growth of these? We have tons of room in the hillside to put these. You have acre and a quarter, 2 acre, 3 acre, 4 acre lots. I mean, you can put a lot of them. We don't get, you're only getting 20 a year, you're not getting a whole bunch of them.
Yeah, so through the chair, I think so I'm going to bifurcate your points. The first is about renters in general, and I think that it's important to remember that we are not changing that an owner must occupy one of the two units. I think that the observation that properties that are rental properties only where the owner doesn't live there is not as valuable. I don't necessarily subscribe to that, but if you do, I think that there should be comfort taken in the fact that an owner is required to live in one of the two units, and if you're an owner, it's your property, you're going to care about it and about your neighborhood. Secondly, is it a real barrier because it seems like you could build these anywhere you wanted on the hillside? And the short answer is, yeah, we do still believe it's a barrier because the neighborhoods where people want to live and want, no offense to South Anchorage, but where people want to live and build these actually might be in other neighborhoods. So right now there's kind of an artificial limit on where they can go, and it's probably why you see the proliferation happening on the hillside is because it's one of the few places people can build. But to meet the demand of the consumer, I think it needs to be more flexible and allowable in other neighborhoods or other parts of town.
Yeah.
So, in my experience again in real estate, I never ever saw an individual who said, I want to buy a house in R1. They may say I want to buy a family home, a single family home, but no one ever said I want to buy a house in R1. In fact, I do hear people say I want to buy a house in R2 or better because I want a duplex. People do actually say that, but I have never heard someone say I want to buy a house in R1. And I do have people who do want to live in a single family home, but I think there's an important difference there. If we think too hard into the wonkiness of it all, we fall apart from the reality of what we're talking about. So I just want to add another voice of experience that it's highly uncommon. And people do want those single family homes, but that's the question we're here to explore. People don't chase zoning unless they're going to build.
Well, I understand. Normal people do not know what R1 is. They just want to know a house on a lot like I grew up.
Right. Yeah,
But
exactly.
I mean, again, it's personal experience. My cousin bought just that kind of home in Portland, and then 10 years later, she decided, I'd like to build basically a guest house for my friends that are traveling through. And at that point, we want to give them the ability to build those houses. I think most people that buy into those things think that somewhere down the road they could build a man cave, as Chris said, or what we consider to be an ADU. Right? Anyway, can we continue moving down through the
Yeah,
points?
you bet. So the next, page 3 of Weddleton questions, related to the one principal structure phraseology that we've used. And he recommends that we change it to attached ADU, and we would say no, because it's very important that you differentiate between the principal structure on a lot and the accessory structure. Accessory dwelling units are accessory to the principal use of, or principal structure of that lot, and it's important, we think, to keep that distinction. Dave?
I might add to this that the ordinance amends Chapter 5 under accessory uses and structures. So it's clearly, ADUs are clearly intended to be accessory to the principal use of the property as a single-family home.
So no, we would not want to change that if possible. Moving on, the next one asks if we were to delete the phrases on lines 38 to 39 on page 4 on a lot, tract, or parcel. We would say no, because that's standard use throughout the rest of the code. Although I understand your question of where else would it go.
So the standard is we garble.
We do. Yes, we do. Got to account for everything. Never know if somebody's going to say, I've got a lot, not a parcel. Next is related to R1s and R1As, particularly if the R1 or R1A is in an area where there is no or little bus service, long distance from jobs, and other daily activities. Is that justified? We would say yes.
I would actually say, I would say some of these things we should skip, because it takes amendment really where, right, because it's the same issue.
Well, no, it's a different issue. It's a nuance that I think is important. The root of your question is, why are we allowing them in R1s and R1As? Because R1s and R1As aren't usually near bus stops or employment centers or other things. And I would say that that is not exclusively true. I also would say that why would we limit people's options when it comes to housing?
Well, we do quite a lot, like zoning. But I mean, my point here wasn't so much, is this all R1, all R1A? Or do we say, okay, well, Ocean View Bay Shore, places like that, not, but as we get into, places near the downtown core, around town centers, so we draw a little circle and say, these places, we make these changes, but in the more remote R1 and R1A, and I it's kind of going through our land use plan, if there's any clear lines already drawn. That was the concept I was going for.
That's a great point through the chair. That's a great point. And as it relates to the land use plan, no, that was not identified as happening in any of the designated, whether it's an RFA or whether it's a designated employment center, et cetera. In the creation of and the promotion of the land use plan update, it was envisioned that accessory dwelling units be one of the tools in the toolbox for boosting housing across the board.
So I'm going to go to Mr. Constant, but then I'm going to ask that maybe if we can get through these last ones a little bit quicker. I just want to be conscious of time because I want to give time to discuss Dick's amendment, but also there are a number of members of the public here, and I'd like to hear from them if we can. Mr. Constant.
Thanks. So if and when this passes, does this strip a homeowners association from restricting the development or a developer from restricting the use of these in a subdivision that they develop?
No. The answer is no. The municipality of Anchorage doesn't enforce homeowners association covenants. That's up to the association. We will place provisions within code. If the association takes it a step further, they could do that.
So really, if a group of neighbors is really opposed to this, they could in fact organize an HOA of their neighbors, their peers, whatever, and say, for our subdivision, this is not going to happen.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Interesting. I'm dealing with a defunct HOA in my district right now too, so I'm curious. They set up an HOA, they say this is prohibited, and then it kind of falls into disrepair. I'm curious how that would.
The municipality, as I said before, doesn't enforce covenants, and so as long as it's permitted within municipal code, we would allow it. It's up to the association to somewhat manage themselves and ensure that they're adhering to their covenants.
And they have the power under law to do that. If the people buy in, they say this is our association, these are our rules, they hold their association, they can then determine this is not allowed here.
Right.
And so if people are really wanting to restrict these uses, they could in fact come up with restrictions to ensure that their sacrosanct single-family lots don't change.
Mr. Dyson.
Yeah. It would help me in this discussion if I knew what the objections some folks have. Are there any people pushing back against this? Are they any more than NIMBYs?
Well, we can get to Dick's amendment, and I think he can express that, and you can decide for yourself whether it's NIMBYism, and then we can. And I think there are some members of the public here that are going to speak in favor, and some that are going to speak in opposition. So you might hear it there too.
Okay, we'll endeavor to get through the next in 5 or 10 minutes at the most. Dave, do you want to do the next one?
Yeah, next one, page 4, lines 49 through 52. How limiting is the current 10,000 square foot lot minimum? We would say that it is limiting. In fact, I can tell you that on a regular basis, I get phone calls about whether or not an individual can do a detached garage with an ADU above it on a R1 property that's less than 10,000 square feet. So I would say that it is limiting, and that I do get phone calls on a regular basis. I would say I've received, since we started this process and started looking at ADUs, I would say I've received probably more than a dozen phone calls. Yep.
The second part of that question is an interesting one, where you're asking, with the minimum lot size deletion, would an ADU be allowed on the 4,000 square foot lot? And I think the answer is yes, provided it does not exceed the minimum or the maximum lot coverage and or the other provisions that are in the code.
Seems like it would be exceedingly difficult to permit.
It would be
but maybe
a very small house and or ADU for sure.
So there are properties, in town that could not support an ADU, detached or attached. Given the lot coverage or setback requirements, it's not possible to do it. So that needs to be clear as well.
Next item is why not allow an accessory dwelling unit on a lot with a child care center? I wish I had an answer to that. That's just verbatim in existing code. We have no idea where that got started, but we'd be happy to look into it. Don't really understand that one myself. That's not a change that we're proposing. It's just existing code. Next is related to the Class B versus the Class A. Why in Class B is the ADU limit a percentage of the principal dwelling unit and lower than it is in Class A? And the answer is there are oftentimes larger homes, and the way that this code is written, the accessory dwelling unit size is a function of whichever is greater, not whichever is less. So the 900 square foot or the 35%, whichever would be greater.
So there's a distinction between Class A and Class B districts. In Class A, you're limited to whichever is less. In Class B, you're allowed whichever is greater, the 900 square feet or the 35%.
To account for those larger lot sizes. Yeah. Next page is asking if the measurement rubric that we use, taller than 15 feet, is that using the mid-height of the roof rule? And the answer is yes. Next comment is related to density, in the fact that ADUs are not included in the density calculations for the site. It does not change the underlying zoning densities allowed. Particularly what we're trying to emphasize throughout the code is that ADUs, the accessory dwelling units, they are accessory to whatever is the primary or principal structure or use on that property. And so in that regard, the accessory dwelling unit is not part of the principal calculation on the density.
Correct. It's not intended to be a duplex.
Correct.
Mr. Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so what you're saying is, by adding an ADU, you all of a sudden don't turn your property into a commercial establishment. Is that correct?
Sort of, yeah. We're just saying it doesn't turn it into a duplex.
Because you could be taxed differently if you're commercial, correct?
Correct.
Well, that's not density, I mean, that's use.
Yeah.
You're talking use
Yeah.
over density. That's a
Okay,
different
all right.
concept. Is that right?
Yeah, you're right. Through the chair, the next one is about trust, transfers to trust, and I'm going to turn that over to Robin or Becky, who's here, and may not be ready for it.
Or Dean. Through the chair, when it comes to trusts, trusts are an entity, it's an ownership entity. And I'll give you an example. Many times you have a trust where the daughter is the authorized representative of the trust, and the beneficiary of that trust is their mother, say. So I would kind of leave it up to a legal opinion as to would either one of those be termed a landlord. I guess in my opinion they would, but again, I think I'll look to the legal minds to confirm that.
You know, my issue on this was kind of, when we re-looked at the septic system things, and someone said, do I have to get a whole new COSA when I just take my house and put it in a trust that I run?
Right.
So I'm going, do they have to do a whole new process for an ADU if that's all they're doing? I don't know what the fee will be, maybe it's $100, no one cares, but.
Well, I don't believe there is a fee for an affidavit of owner occupancy, but as ownership changes, we expect that you will come in and update the owner occupancy affidavit.
Actually, that brings an interesting point for me, though. So, if you build an ADU and you live there, or let's say your mother lives there in the house, she's the primary occupant, and then she passes away, are you now sort of restricted in who you can sell this to? Because what if someone wants to buy it and use it as a rental property? Can they?
They would not be allowed.
The ADU basically has locked you in, so you can never be a rental property for any future owner.
Only one of them.
Both units could not be rental.
Gotcha. So somebody has to live there.
The owner has to occupy one of the two, either the principal or the accessory dwelling.
Right, and so if you have a transfer within a family, as John says, let's say we have a child that lives in South Anchorage or in East Anchorage, and their parent has this similar home living with now an ADU. So in a way, you're sort of saying that if that house is transferred through the estate to the child, they have to either move into that house or sell that house.
Or not use the
Or
IDU.
sell it to someone who they themselves would be willing to sign the affidavit they will live there.
Yeah.
That's it. So they have to either sell the house or live in the house. They couldn't keep it in the family, but as a rental property.
Or not occupy.
The ADU.
Yeah, just don't occupy the other building.
Okay, so you can hold the house but not occupy the ADU.
There's even a subtler nub in there, though, and that is that and imagine a situation where you have an elderly beneficiary of a trust, the property is owned by the trust, the caregiver is actually living in the second unit. Then you have two renting tenants, and you have created a snafu because the beneficiary isn't the owner, it's the trust. And so there's some exploration I think you ought to do, kind of contemplating how some of those disability issues will work in these properties, because we could find ourselves in a fair housing snafu and not know it.
Yeah, I guess what I was trying to get at is I don't want the construction of an ADU to effectively force a property out of a family or out of a person with disability, force them to no longer own their property.
I think the municipal attorney would like to add some color to this.
Yeah, 2 points on the trust issue, 2 fine points on the trust issue. To Mr. Weddleton's question, yes, this language as addressed would require a transfer to a trust to come in, like for that trust, the representative of the trust to come in and register it. For whether you want to do that, I think the challenge with creating a blanket exception for transfers to trust is that you sweep into that any transfer from me to your family trust. For instance, my husband is an estate planning attorney, so we own everything that we own through various trusts. And so if we through our trust purchase a property from you, that would somehow also be a question. But that, I think, is simply a language choice for what you'd like to see. I'll point to Mr. Constance's question about individuals who might be living as a beneficiary of a trust. That those folks are not technically tenants. They are not tenants of the trust. They are beneficiaries of different legal relationships. So to the extent they're actually the beneficiary of the trust, I don't think that that's impacted by the rental property restrictions.
Mr. Dyson, do you have a point?
I appreciate you raising that. I want there to be very little restriction on property that's a part of an estate and so on. And I just encourage all of us to, our job here isn't to make it tougher for people to do what they want to do with their own real estate. And our only responsibility from my perspective is to make sure that whatever is done with that piece of real estate isn't demonstrably negative to others. that doesn't mean aesthetics and so on and so forth, and what kind of shrubs or green space they have. It's none of their darn business. And also, we want to be careful. I don't think we need to go too far to trying to protect people from being stupid. We don't want to be discriminatory against stupid people. We want them to be able to own their property almost anywhere and do stupid things if they want to. As long as it doesn't hurt the neighbor.
It's one of the founding principles of this country.
Sorry?
No, I agree with you. I guess just so my comments aren't misinterpreted. I don't think you were misinterpreting. I'm not sort of pushing back against the ADU ordinance. I'm pushing it back against the ownership requirement, that you have to live owner occupancy because of some of these situations that I could see developing. And I agree with you that unless it's demonstrably harming other people, people should be allowed to do on their property. But
yeah, and if we're going to do the trust thing, if I may, or the estate thing, if we're going to, we need to give them some grace. If previously the owner had to live in it, that's fine. Owner croaks, and the estate's trying to figure out what to do with it. We ought to give them 3 or 5 years at least to work through the transition, what the estate's going to do it, particularly if the kids are fighting each other, so on and so forth. You give them some slack.
also an interesting point. So let's move on, if we could, to the other points.
We're at the very end, if you're okay. Through the chair, the last item in the list is about an effective date, and then the following 3 are all typographical errors, and we concur with all 4 of those proposed changes, and we'll make those in the forthcoming S version.
Wonderful. So if now we could maybe discuss Mr. Trainey's amendment, and hopefully, here's a simple but thorny, and then have some time left over for the members of the public.
Thank you. Mine's decision will be agreed to as a body in 2003 after numerous nights of open testimony. This is what this assembly agreed to. Now we're getting a whole revision. And I represent a lot of community councils that don't want to see this revision. So, let's remember going forward. As my neighbors have told me, we do not want to ghettoize Anchorage. And that's what they view this as doing.
Through the chair, we just offered one comment on the amendment, and I don't know if it was intentional, Assemblymember Trainey, or not. The proposed ordinance doesn't keep things the same. It actually makes it more restrictive than it is presently. And the one nuance in that is the inclusion of attached ADUs in your prohibition. So I don't know if that's intentional or not, but I wanted to point that out.
Thank you.
Right, because the attached are currently allowed.
Correct.
So get rid of both attached and detached. So, is there any comments about Mr. Trainey's amendment? I guess, could you guys explain a little bit more clearly why you perhaps are opposed to this?
Certainly, I'll start, but through the chair, largely what we have heard from not only the folks who build these things, but from a lot of the folks who want to live in these things, the current restrictions in code artificially limit where accessory dwelling units will be allowed, and we're precluding whole sections of the community from having accessory dwelling units and making affordable residence more accessible. We feel that the protections that continue to exist in code should help provide against some of the common fears, not only from our own community, but these are fears that communities across the country have wrestled with for decades as they've looked at how to deal with accessory dwelling units while also balancing a need to produce housing. We think that the protections that are in place, particularly as it relates to limitations on setbacks, lot coverage, size of units, heights of units, et cetera, provide adequate protections to help ensure that neighborhood character stays the same, but also provides an additional housing tool for not only for the city but for property owners themselves. So we would encourage that the restrictions on R1 and R1A be lifted, but that is certainly the viewpoint that we have, and it comes through not only best practices across the country, but the voices that we've heard in the community over the past couple of years.
Thank you, Mr. Schutte. Mr. Trainey.
Just that what this does currently without this would allow anybody on a 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 square foot, and it will change the character of this town. and you've got homes being plopped in, and their ADU being plopped in next to it. That will change the way this town functions to operate. And I would suggest most of the builders who want this don't live in Anchorage. They live out in the valley. They've already got out of Anchorage, but they still want to build what they want here, and they're gone now. So, like I said, we'll hear from our community councils. And maybe it's changed since 2003, that down seriously. People buy R1A for specific reason, the type of housing stock they want to live next door. This will change it dramatically, I think.
Thank you, Mr. Trainor. Mr. Constant.
My concern, as we talked about, is that this amendment will restrict in my district any ADUs because there isn't a lot in my district larger than 10,000 square feet. And that is a challenge for me to contemplate because I have neighbors that are hounding me to get this done so that they can do a dwelling on their property in their neighborhood. So that's my kind of concern relative to this amendment. It's very broad. So that's the only concern.
Give me a number that works for you and we can talk.
Mr. Peters.
Thank you. My question is 10,000 square, is that like a 10,000 square feet, a quarter acre?
That'd be just shy of a quarter acre.
It's a big lot.
I agree.
A lot of the old lots in Anchorage during the 60s were 10,000 square foot lots. But as the town got more dense, they've dropped down. In fact, my daughter has one in your area. She has a tiny house that's on 9,000 square foot lot. Her house is only like 900 square feet.
I would add through the chair also that sort of as a follow-up to Assemblymember Peterson's comments and Assemblymember Training's concerns, keep in mind that by eliminating the 10,000 square foot limitation, you could have an accessory dwelling unit built on a 4,000 square foot lot, but that accessory dwelling unit, whether it's attached or detached, still has to conform to the by right sizes that are allowed on that lot. So what we're saying is a 4,000 square foot lot can build a house of X size by right now. So if they choose not to develop an ADU or they're not allowed to develop an ADU, they can still do additions or add a second floor or whatever to fill up that lot to the maximum extent they're allowed to do by law, which we're not proposing to change at all. If by adding an accessory dwelling unit, which might look like a tiny house on the back of the lot, should it fit, 4,000 square feet would be tough, but should it fit, it would be two structures. One would be accessory to the principal, to the existing home, and I personally believe has a much different aesthetic feel than a home that suddenly doubles or triples in size.
Okay, I feel like this will be an ongoing discussion for the next month or so. So for now, we have about almost 20 minutes left. Is there any members of the public who would like to speak on this? And please, because we have several people, can we limit it to 3 minutes? Mr. Potter.
For the record, my name is Tim Potter, private citizen, single-family homeowner in Katy and Rivera's district, and in the Rogers Park Community Council. I don't have a 10,000 square foot lot, and I have a specific lot that would not accommodate a detached, but I am interested in doing an attached unit. That could be as much as 900 square feet, which is a little bit less than one floor in the basement of my house. And primarily that's because you know, as your parents get older and they pass away and they start going into your own age bracket, and your spouse has health issues that are going to continually deteriorate her quality of life, that it may be very necessary to have a healthcare assistant or a tenant. We have a great nursing program at our university, which is very close to College Building subdivision. Our hope would be that we could have a separate living situation where a nursing student could provide health care and assistance to my wife. I could continue to work, and everybody would be happy. That person may or may not have a car. We already have room for 2-car garages and a 3-car wide driveway. The Rogers Park Community Council has been very outspoken, and I've gotten skewered for my support on a couple of occasions at least. But it's very important for you all to understand that accessory dwelling units are not a cheap alternative to increasing the amount of residential units. It's a very important tool, but it's not one that every Tom, Dick, and Harry, or Mary, Sally, and Susie are going to go build. It's complicated. When you're fitting in and retrofitting into an existing lot and building, it can get very difficult and very expensive. Now, Clay Porter, who I hope will speak, is my neighbor 2 houses away. He has a much larger lot than I have. I have a corner lot which has setback restrictions that are significantly different than what and in the middle of the road. So that's part of my problem. He does not have that problem, and he can talk about his mother-in-law and healthcare issues associated with that. So I think that there's a misnomer about who all these boogie people are that are going to be moving into these very cheap, crappy accessory dwelling units. And I hate to get that frank and blunt with my language, but it is when there's an amendment, and I'm not accusing you of anything, Vic, but when there is an amendment to increase the lot size to a threshold that you know addresses most of the lots in the area that I live. My lot's 8,700 square feet. And, you know, yes, I moved in a single family neighborhood. Do I think that, like anything, if it's tastefully done and it's done well, there shouldn't be a problem. We need accessory dwelling units across the city, but we need them primarily in those areas that are close to where the employment centers are. I live directly next to University of Alaska and directly down the street from Providence Hospital and not very far from Alaska Regional, which are some of the major employers of all kinds of pay scales that we want to have housing for close to home, not up on top of O'Malley Road, where they have to drive down the hill, use gas, trade flute just to go to the grocery store.
Tim, thank you very much. I want to address the fairness for other people in their time. We'll start with this gentleman and then Kathy.
My name is Clay Porter. I'm an architect and a contractor in the city. I've been designing and building this city since 1972. And over the years, I've probably done 15 or 20 accessory dwelling units. I hope all of them were present in the appropriate conformance to the ordinances. But at the present moment, I'm working on 3 different ones. And they happen to be in an they happen to be in an R5 zoning. But I get calls all the time and questions about detached in an R1 or R1A. The problem attached many times in an R1 or R1A is that the circulation around the structure, the parking, how you get to it, how you have separation within that one building with the number of people that live there in a family. I guarantee you that I no more want to have an attached ADU to my house and have my daughter living across the next door. It's just not going to work in that. And each family varies and is different. The separation. My mother-in-law, I moved her here many years ago, and it would have been very nice, and she would have liked to have had a small unit, on the lot. I can do one on my lot, but I'm an exception with the size of my lot at that point. But many years ago, I was taught by a mentor that as you age gracefully, you need to be closer to your services, not further away. And as we see this, and I see it in the properties I do 20, 30 additions a year, and as I see it, they keep moving closer to where the services are, the nodes, the centers, and people want to be downtown, or they want to be fairly close. They want to be maybe on the south side of the park strip, but they want these kinds of locations. So to me, it makes a great deal of sense. It also makes sense that the design concerns or constraints have to be used and are crucial. I just read an article 2 days ago. The city of Austin, Texas, has been doing that. They think it's very, very beneficial. Back to the cost issue, they are not cheap. The one we're getting ready to start out on Mary Street or Mary Drive, just south of Platte, it is $40,000 more than the initial budget that the client wanted to spend. And my costs have to do with size being small, but they also have to do with my utilities and how I did my dirt work and how I deal with the site without killing it and wrecking that site. And that's all part of it. So the idea of the new constraints, I like the rules, I like the zoning base not changing, but I also think that the detached offer a tremendous amount benefit to the city. And you're not gonna see 2,000 of these things built in a year. You might see 15 or 20, if that. But it is part of the changing character of our city. Most of the lots in third edition in a lot of areas, they're not. They're 6, 7, 8,000 square feet. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Porter. Kathy, would you like to speak?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Kathy Gleason, President of Attorney and City Council. We did write a comment letter that I hope you all received in the official packet back in February when we presented before the Planning and Zoning Commission. And I think I'm looking at those visuals of what exists now and some of the ADUs. But what those photos don't show is how the adjacent property owners are impacted. They're pretty tight, pretty tight. So you can't really get a feel for how the next door neighbors may have been affected by that kind of development. And that's one of the concerns that Trinity Community Council has. Just for the record, I live in a zero lot line. This won't impact me. But there are a lot of single family R1, R1A homes in Turnagain that this would apply to. And so our basic concerns was parking. I'm glad to hear that traffic engineer would have a say in that. I'm not sure our council was aware of that when we wrote our comments. But we really feel like on-site parking should be a requirement for anything in R1 and R1A. Also, we're just concerned about open space, daylight, breathability, and property value impacts to what potentially could be built next door to your neighbor's lot. And so if you have a nice garden, and then all of a sudden your neighbor builds something that's 2-story, and all of a sudden it creates shade on your yard, that's an impact. If you have a view of the mountains right now, and somebody builds something, all of a sudden takes away your view of the mountains. It's those kind of intangible but really critical things that I would characterize as concerns and not fears, as was characterized earlier today. They're concerns, and I think they should be legitimately concerned when you're looking at doing what you're doing, reducing setbacks, allowing essentially R1 and R1A zoning to turn into R2. And you are doing that, and you have to admit that that's what this code would do. There's no doubt about it. And so, in our view, there's no doubt about it. And whether that's what this city wants, I'll let it up to you to decide, but you can't pretend these are then still single-family lots. They won't be. There potentially won't be. So bottom line is what Turnagain was asking, among other things, go back to some of the existing restrictions with regard to ADUs of R1 and R1A. But if the city really feels we need more housing, if this is one approach to get it, then at least require a variance and have the property owner go through a public notice to their adjacent neighbors' lots and to the community council, so that we can see just what kind, if any, detrimental impacts could be potentially put on people who live adjacent to those who choose to build these detached and even attached ADUs, depending on the size, the architecture, the position within their lot, how close it is to their neighbor's lot, what impact it may have. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gleason. Ma'am, can you identify yourself for the record, please?
Yeah, I'm Hita Ben, I'm a private citizen. I have adult children, so I want to, in their 30s, I wanted, these gentlemen have addressed quite eloquently the older parent issue, but I wanted to bring up from my own personal experience, the millennials are also a part of the economy and part of our community that would be very interested in ADUs. I don't want my kids living in my basement anymore. It's not good for any of us. This is a viable option for you to live in a smaller ADU or be able to buy a house and rent out part of it and get income and also qualify for a loan. So I think there's a lot of people that can benefit from ADUs across the age spectrum. And there is a problem in our community of lack of houses in all different price points. And if we're going to attract workers, attract businesses, we have to have an entry-level place for young people
Thank you. Was it Benz or Benz?
Beds like in the car.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Constant.
A note on that. I have a very particular incident of a neighbor who's been asking for this ordinance to be passed, and his concern is like yours but different. He wants to build an ADU that his daughter can live in, but the intent actually is when him and his wife become very elderly to switch, so that he and his wife can live in the smaller unit, and his daughter with her growing family can live in the main unit. And so there are concerns across the lifespan that this helps to resolve.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Are there any other members of the public, or I guess anyone at all, who might want to speak? We have 4 more minutes.
Mr. Chair, we'll just offer, Robin, can you go back to that earlier slide on the changes?
Oh, we have one slide. that has
Oh, which you
proposed
can't read anyway. So I just wanted to point out that one of the comments that we've heard today about shading was something that we thought long and hard about, because there is, whether it's an ADU or whether it's your neighbor building a garage even, shading and visual impact is something that we always consider. For accessory dwelling units, we actually increased the required side setback, so it got larger than it is currently, to help alleviate some of that. Now, it won't alleviate every shading incident out there, and my neighbor is guilty of that right now, but by at least increasing the side setback, we've done one thing to help minimize at least the full extent of potential shading impact on neighboring properties. And then to speak to the visual impairment issue, again, the one thing that we remind people is that this doesn't change what can happen by right currently. And again, pointing out my neighbor, if you build an addition or a second story on your home, which you are allowed to do by right, it has the same impact on your view shed as building an accessory dwelling unit might. So accessory dwelling units don't in and of themselves exacerbate these issues. They only do so to the extent that property owners currently are allowed to do by right under the existing zoning.
Thank you. Mr. Wellington.
Is this ordinance posted somewhere? I tried to find it this morning, I couldn't, but it'd be nice if this ordinance in your PowerPoint were posted. I'd send them out to my community council.
Through the chair, the ordinance is posted. It was posted as part of the agenda packet 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, they do. So this morning I emailed Lisa and asked her to, in the items of interest, to include this ordinance.
It's actually still posted, but I think when you click on the link via the clerk's website, you don't get it. It is still available though, but our PowerPoint presentation is not, and we'd be happy to add it to that.
Lisa?
And I'll be adding the link to the items of interest as well. I wasn't able to do it on this computer, so I've got to wait till after the meeting.
Can we perhaps under that include the PowerPoint presentation? Is that okay? So that would be pretty accessible.
Maybe even Dick's amendment. I mean, that's the play.
Put my amendment out there too.
Okay.
Happy to do it.
Awesome. Well, with that, this work session is adjourned.